Section 1 of Imperialism and World Politics, Part 1 of 4, by Parker Thomas Moon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alistair. Chapter 1. Significance of Imperialism, World Conquest and World Unrest. The American public is barely beginning to realize the significance of the present-day imperialism, which is now approaching its denouement. Of ancient imperialism, of the empires of Alexander, of Cyrus, of Caesar, we have heard much, and of Napoleon's spectacular exploits every schoolboy has read. But the realms conquered by military emperors of past ages were baubles, trifles compared with the far-flung dominions which have been won, more often with the pen than by the sword, in our own supposedly prosaic generation. It is with this contemporary empire-building, and its effects on international relations, on our prosperity and our security, on industry and civilization, that this study is concerned. Little as the general public may realize the fact, imperialism is the most impressive achievement and the most momentous world problem of our age. Perhaps this statement should be thrust home. More than half of the world's land surface and more than 1 billion human beings are included in the colonies and backward countries dominated by a few imperialist nations. Every man, woman, and child in Great Britain has 10 colonial subjects, black, brown, and yellow. For every acre in France, there are 20 in the French colonies and protectorates. Italy is 1/6 as large as her colonies, Portugal 1/23rd, Belgium 1/80th. The nations of Western Europe are dwarfs beside their colonial possessions. How prevalent imperialism was in Europe before the war, and still remains, is difficult for Americans to appreciate, since the average American has been accustomed, at any rate before the disillusionment of 1919, to think that the seizure of territory was somewhat akin to theft, that militarism and aggressive war were out of date among democratic nations, that conquest was contrary to the normal principles of international morality, albeit some slight deviation from such principles might be pardoned or ignored. If we desired Louisiana or Alaska, we purchased it. If we annexed the Philippines, we paid a price in gold. Footnote: the payment in this case was not strictly speaking a purchase price. Confer infra, page 396. See Imperialism and World Politics, Part 3, Section 7. Subheading, Educating the Filipinos. Footnote ends. This, however, is not and has not been the attitude of imperialist nations of Europe or of Europeanized Japan. French statesmen have vehemently declared the conquest of colonies to be not only merely permissible, but imperative for France, and the Third Republic has won almost 5 million square miles. Italian patriots have proclaimed it a sacred duty, and Italy, despite all discouragements, has gained almost 1 million square miles. Englishmen have regarded it, in Kipling's words, as the white man's burden, which civilized peoples dare not shirk, and in the last half-century 4 million square miles have been added to the British Empire, besides many a veiled protectorate and sphere of influence not formally annexed. Germany at first, under Bismarck's cautious guidance, abstained from African and Asiatic empire building, but at length plunged into world politics, rather late, to appropriate 1 million square miles in Africa and the East Indies, to dominate the rich Asiatic empire of the Ottoman sultans, and finally to stake all and lose all in the Titanic conflict of 1914. Austria-Hungary, as lesser partner in the Central European coalition, strove to master the Balkans. Russian Tsars, not content with their broad domain in Europe and Siberia, stretched acquisitive hands into Central Asia, Persia, Manchuria, and Mongolia, and looked hungrily on Turkey, Tibet, and Afghanistan. Japan, aptly imitating Europe, took Formosa, Korea, part of Manchuria, Shantung, German islands in the Pacific, and, during the Great War, attempted at a single stroke to make all China virtually a Japanese protectorate. All the great powers save the United States boldly and frankly set themselves to the epic task in the 19th century of carving out stupendous colonial empires, and even the United States, feeling the same urge to action, reached into the Pacific and into the Caribbean for modest parcels of colonial territory. Nor were the great powers more imperialist than several of the smaller nations. Belgium, with her vast property in Central Africa, Portugal, with colonies larger than the German Kaisers, Spain, clinging tenaciously to a strip of Morocco, together with the pitiable fragments of her former colonial grandeur, and Holland, glorifying in a magnificent East Indian island empire, have vied with the stronger states in seeking the rewards which all hoped to win in the stirring game of world politics. World politics. It is a phrase to conjure with. Imperialism has given birth to worldwide empires, to worldwide diplomacy. Great Britain is not, in truth, a European nation, but the nucleus of a universal power. The tricolour of France flies in the Congo jungle, on Sahara's sands, above Indo-Chinese rice fields. European diplomatists act the drama of international relations on a stage as broad as Earth. Often a single diplomatic bargain, signed so easily in a European capital, affects the destinies of unwitting millions in all 4 quarters of the globe. The Anglo-French Agreement of 1904, for example, dealt with Newfoundland in America, the New Hebrides in Oceania, Siam in Asia, Morocco and Egypt and other colonies in Africa. Such is the meaning of world politics. And imperialism is the root and raison d'etre of world politics. If, from this commanding standpoint, one reviews the recent history of international relations, the alliances, ententes, crises, and wars reveal a new meaning. Almost without exception, they were but surface manifestations of the swift, deep current of imperialism. When France and England trembled on the verge of war in 1898, during the Fashoda crisis, imperialist rivalry for a million or so square miles of the African Sudan was the cause. The German Emperor's celebrated telegram to President Kruger, congratulating him on having repulsed a British invasion, was more than a breach of international etiquette. It was a revelation of the tense imperialist competition in South Africa, and as such, it both angered and alarmed British statesmen. The Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911, which so nearly embroiled all Europe in war, were not unique results of some peculiarly German, or peculiarly French, aggressiveness. Rather, they were 2 of the innumerable explosions which have been caused when the aims of imperialist nations happened to cross. The South African War of 1899 may have been inaugurated by the truculent Boers, but it would never have been fought had English imperialism not been active in South Africa. Nor would the Spanish-American War have occurred if there had been no American interests in Cuba. The greatest war the 20th century had witnessed, before 1914, was the purely imperialist Russo-Japanese struggle for Korea and Manchuria. And the greatest of all wars was caused more by imperialism than by any other single factor. Americans who prefer to believe that the catastrophe of 1914 was brought about by the personal vagaries of William Hohenzollern may cherish their belief if they will, but the facts are opposed to it. The very alignment of the European powers was dictated by imperialism, not by race or democracy or kinship of culture. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey were allied by Teutonic domination of the Near East. Republican France and monarchist England were bound together by the far-reaching imperialist bargain of 1904. Liberal England and Tsarist Russia by an agreement of 1907 regarding imperialist interests in Persia, Afghanistan, Tibet. It is easy to heap up the evidence, though no laboured proof is intended here. When the German ambassador in 1914 offered to respect the integrity of Belgium and France, the significant question of Sir Edward Grey was whether Germany intended to take the French colonies. During the war, even when hard-pressed on the battlefields of France, the Allies spared troops to conquer German colonies and occupy choice portions of Turkey. When the German government secretly formulated its war aims for communication to President Wilson, a larger share of the world's colonies was the important point. The Allies, for their part, while professing publicly their interest in small nations and the sanctity of treaties, quietly arranged by a series of secret treaties the division to be made of Germany's colonies and of Turkey if victory should be theirs. And when victory was achieved, the Allies made it one of their first concerns at the Paris Peace Conference to wring from President Wilson's unwilling lips an assurance that, though the coveted colonial and Near Eastern territories might be nominally internationalized as mandates, the mandates would be given to the Allies in accordance with the secret treaties. Contrary to a quite general impression, imperialism is not a closed story now that the German colonies have been divided. The climax has not yet been reached. The denouement is still uncertain. Never was imperialist rivalry so keen as after the Great War. We are now entering a period of intensified international economic competition, in which the problem of imperialism is becoming all the more acute because most of the backward areas available for colonies have already been appropriated. Competition is stimulated by scarcity. There are no longer vast unclaimed reaches of Africa to sate the appetites of rising powers. Moreover, tariff barriers are being erected in hitherto open colonies. Governments are taking a more vital interest and sometimes officially participating in the international scramble for oil, railway, and mining concessions. The tide of immigrant surplus population from Europe and Asia is being turned back upon itself by American restrictions to seek new outlets. Backward peoples are fast becoming educated to the point of providing a really important and rapidly increasing market for manufactures. Raw materials are becoming more and more the stakes of diplomacy. A few instances of the increasing economic importance of the colonies will make these general statements more convincing. The exports of the United States to our own and other colonies amounted in 1900 to less than 1/5 of $1 billion, in 1913 to 2/3 of $1 billion, in 1920 to more than $1.5 billion. In 20 years, our exports to colonies were multiplied by 8.8, other exports only by 5.4. These figures are mute witnesses to the all-important fact that the United States, like other industrial nations, is becoming increasingly dependent on non-European countries as markets for manufactured goods. Colonial markets are growing much more rapidly than European markets. To put it more clearly, non-European countries absorbed only 23% of the exports of the United States before 1900, the average from 1895 to 9, but their share rose to 40% in 1913, then 46% in 1920, and 49.8% in 1923. Almost 60% of the new business which American exporters have gained since the 1890s has been found in Asia, Africa, and America. To generalize, in the decade from 1913 to 1923, the imports of colonies increased by 51%, while the imports of other countries increased by less than 16%. Colonies in 1923 meant $5 billion worth of export business, of which $2 billion had been added in a decade. Conversely, as industrial countries import more raw materials and foodstuffs, colonial sources of supply are drawn upon more and more heavily. To take the United States as an example again, the value of imports from colonies increased almost tenfold in the 2 decades from 1900 to 1920. From colonies and quasi-colonial backward countries, we get our crude rubber, much of our oil, fertilizers for farmlands, fruit and coffee for the breakfast table, chocolate and sugar for the confectioner, tobacco, tea, hemp for rope, and jute for all the millions of bags in which goods are packed for shipment, indispensable manganese for our steel mills. Inconceivably more do the less richly endowed European nations rely upon colonial products. Colonial investments, too, are multiplying, mounting into billions of dollars for the United States, and into tens of billions for the imperialist nations collectively. More will be said later about their importance. Colonies and backward countries, spoils of diplomacy before the war, are vital features of everyday business today. Whether they are closed or open, developed or retarded, monopolized or shared freely, will be a much more significant question tomorrow than it was yesterday. Perhaps even more challenging as an omen of the approaching climax of imperialism is the uneasy stirring of non-European races, which have been subjected to enough European rule to become restive. During the last few years, a spirit of rebellious self-determination has seized upon hitherto inert subject races. Nationalist Turkey has turned against European exploitation. Nationalist Egypt has won independence. Indian nationalism has assumed monumental proportions. Nationalist Persia and Afghanistan have cast off British shackles. Filipinos have become more insistent in their pleas for independence. Whether this movement of non-European peoples for self-government will reach peaceful maturity is a grave question for the entire civilized world. But even more interesting is the prospect, of which one can only catch faint glimpses now, beyond the question of self-government. What will be the situation when India's factories, now springing up like mushrooms, are numbered by the hundreds of thousands instead of by thousands? When China's industrious masses are harnessed, as more than 1 million Japanese now are, to modern industrial machinery, when Asiatic manufactures on a large scale compete with European and American industries. Steadily and surely, and far more rapidly than many casual observers believe, the so-called backward nations are borrowing not only superficial traits of European civilization, but European methods of industry, of war, of government, of education. The day is dawning when the deficiencies which made these peoples backward and impotent in the face of European imperialism will no longer exist, and like Japan, such countries as China, India, Persia, Egypt, Turkey, Siam, and perhaps even parts of Africa will use the machines and the weapons, and respond to the nationalistic and democratic sentiments which have given Europe her seemingly impregnable world mastery. India has 320 millions to Great Britain's 44 millions of inhabitants. China has possibly 400 millions to the 39 of France. Asia and Africa have over 1 billion to Europe's 500 million. The imperialist great powers of today are but pygmies prodding giants into activity. Which will be the great powers of tomorrow? In the following chapters, imperialism will be viewed both as an achievement and as a world problem, the significance of which has been merely suggested in the foregoing rather sketchy introduction. The most natural starting point for a systematic study will be found in the background, beginnings, and causes of the movement. After that, we may proceed chapter by chapter with a survey of its development, and, at the end, look back over the material to generalize and criticize. End of section 1.